Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Today, I want to share with you a story about a young woman whose life was shattered into pieces, only to find the truest kind of love in the most unforgiving of places. It's a story about looking past the deep scars the world leaves on us and finding a soul that perfectly matches your own. If you want to ride along with Maggie and find out if she conquers the mountain and the fierce Apache man waiting at the top, subscribe to this channel. Stay till the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Margaret Hollowell dropped to her knees in the damp dirt and pressed her forehead against the cold, rough stone of her dead father's gravestone. The autumn wind whipped across the barren Ohio cemetery, but she barely felt the chill. At 24 years old, Maggie had absolutely nothing left in the world. She had no family who cherished her, no home to return to, and no man who had ever bothered to look her way with anything resembling kindness. Just hours before, her own brother had stood in the doorway of the farmhouse their father had built with his own hands. He had just sold the property to settle his gambling debts, leaving Maggie completely without shelter, without a hint of remorse. He had packed her meager, patched belongings into a rough flour sack and set them on the porch like trash left for collection. His cruel words still rattled in her mind. She was too plain, too loud, too stubborn, and an impossible burden. But as Maggie knelt in the mud, her tears finally stopped falling. A quiet, iron resolve settled into her chest. She had spent her entire life shrinking herself to fit into spaces where she wasn't wanted. She was done crying. She was done begging for a sliver of affection. And she was completely done being thrown away. Her trembling fingers reached into the pocket of her faded gray dress. Pulling out a piece of paper she had read so many times, the creases were wearing completely through. It was a response to an advertisement, a desperate arrangement for a marriage of convenience high in the rugged, untamed mountains of Colorado. The letter offered no sweet promises of love, no tender words, and certainly no luxuries. It promised only a harsh mountain life, endless hard work, and the absolute necessity of survival. The man who had written it was an Apache warrior who had retreated far from the towns below, building a fortress of solitude near the clouds. The rumors that traveled down the stagecoach lines painted him as massive, fiercely scarred, and deeply unapproachable. He was a man who didn't smile, didn't talk, and had walled his heart off in ice. His reputation was so intimidating that 7 different women had already accepted his offer and traveled up that treacherous mountain trail. 7 women had tried to endure his heavy silence, and 7 women had run away, terrified, fleeing back down to the valley below. But Maggie wasn't running anymore. For the first time in her life, a man had sent out a call asking for someone strong. And strong was the one thing Maggie knew how to be. She carefully folded the letter, tucked it safely back against her heart, and gripped the handle of her worn carpet bag. She was going to board that stagecoach. She was going to climb that mountain to meet this fierce Apache man. If the mountain killed her, at least she'd die standing. The stagecoach driver pulled the reins and spat tobacco into the dust. He turned around slow, eyeing the big woman sitting alone in the back seat. Her hands folded tight over a worn carpet bag like it held everything she owned in the world. It did. Hank Beaumont tipped his crooked hat back. His face, weathered by years of navigating the treacherous Colorado passes. He looked at Margaret Hollowell with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. He warned her that he had hauled 7 brides up this mountain, hauled every last one back down. Some were crying, some were cussing, and one near about lost her mind. Maggie Hollowell didn't blink. She looked right back into the driver's eyes, her own filled with an unwavering resolve. She told Mr. Beaumont he would save himself a return trip, because she wasn't coming back down. Hank scratched his jaw, studying her. She wasn't what the mountain expected. She was a woman in her mid-20s, broad in the shoulders, thick in the hips, with hands roughed up from years of scrubbing other people's floors and kneading other people's bread. Her dress was plain gray cotton, patched at the elbows, and her bonnet had seen better days. But her eyes burned with something Hank hadn't seen in any of the others. He felt compelled to try one last time. He pressed her, saying Caleb Drummond wasn't right, that the war had broken something in that man. He told her Caleb didn't talk, didn't smile, and sure as Sunday didn't want a wife. Maggie's jaw tightened as she replied that she knew what broken looked like. She confessed she had been broken her whole life. But the difference was nobody had ever bothered putting her back together. Hank went quiet at that. He'd driven coaches for 20 years and heard every kind of brave talk from every kind of woman. But he could hear the truth in her voice. Low, steady, and coming whether you liked it or not. He cracked the reins, and the horses lurched forward up the narrow mountain trail. As the coach rattled over rocks and ruts, Maggie gripped the seat. She looked out the window and noticed the trees were thinning. The air tasted different up here. It was hot and dry, thick with pine and dust. Summer in the high country wasn't soft. It was fierce. The sun hit harder. The wind blew meaner. And the silence stretched so wide it could swallow a person whole. Finally, Hank pulled the horses to a stop. Maggie stepped out, her boots hitting the hard-packed earth. Ahead, leaning against a split-rail fence with his arms crossed and a rifle resting against his hip, stood Caleb Drummond. The stories hadn't lied. Not one bit. He was an Apache man in his late 20s. And he was massive. Taller than any man she'd seen, with shoulders wide enough to block a doorway. His dark, piercing eyes were heavily guarded, set deep above sharp cheekbones. A scar ran jagged from his left temple down to his jaw like someone had tried to split his face open and nearly succeeded. His shirt was stained with sweat. The sleeves rolled past, forearms corded with muscle and old scars. He was expecting a white woman to take one terrified look at his heritage, the brutal landscape, and the ruin of his scarred face, and flee. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her the way a wolf watches a rabbit, measuring, calculating, already deciding she wasn't worth the effort. Maggie's heart kicked hard against her ribs. Every instinct told her to climb back into that coach. But every memory told her there was nothing to climb back to. She squared her shoulders, tightened her grip on her carpet bag, and walked straight toward him. She planted her feet just 3 paces from him, with her voice trembling only on the inside. She asked if he was going to stand there looking mean, or if he was going to help her with her bag. She boldly stated she didn't ride 6 days in a rattlebox coach to be stared at like livestock. Behind her, Hank choked on his tobacco. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He looked her over, slow and deliberate. The way a man looks at a horse he's deciding whether to buy. His gaze lingered on her thick arms, her wide hips, and her work-roughed hands. "You're bigger than I expected," he said, his voice deep, resonant, and entirely flat. There was no apology in his tone. Maggie's chin lifted defiantly. And you're ruder than I expected." Guess we're both disappointed. Something flickered behind those intense, guarded eyes. It wasn't warmth. Not yet. But it was surprise. It was the kind of shock a man feels when something he'd written off as weak suddenly bites back. Without another word, he reached down, picked up her bag with one hand like it weighed no more than a biscuit, and turned toward the trail. Maggie followed. Behind them, Hank muttered a prayer for her. Absolutely certain she'd be gone before Saturday, Caleb pushed the heavy wooden door open and walked into the cabin without looking back. Maggie stepped inside and stopped. The place was exactly what she'd expected from a man who'd been profoundly alone for far too long. It was bare, rough, and stripped of anything that suggested a woman had ever set foot in it. A stone fireplace took up one wall, and a wooden table sat in the middle of the room. But what caught Maggie's eye and squeezed at her chest was the seating. There was one chair at that table. Not two. One. He was already pulling a knife from its sheath, settling onto a small stool by the fireplace. He didn't look at her with longing or hope. He looked at her like a temporary disruption, jerking his chin toward the narrow bed in the corner. He told her the bed was hers, and he would sleep on the floor. Then, in a voice devoid of emotion, he laid out the cold reality of their lives. You cook. You mend. You keep the fire. I hunt. I chop. I keep trouble off the mountain. That was the arrangement. Maggie repeated the word slowly, tasting it on her tongue. It was not a marriage. It was an arrangement. She shot back that he could call it what he wanted. But she called it lonely. And she hadn't come all this way for lonely. She'd had plenty of that back home. Caleb's jaw worked. He turned back to his knife, the blade hissing against the wet stone. He warned her that the others hadn't lasted a week. And most didn't last 3 days. When Maggie stepped closer, demanding to know exactly what the others had said before they ran, his hands stilled on the blade. For a long moment, only the crackle of the low fire filled the space between them. His voice dropped low as he listed his failures. The first one cried the whole first night. The second couldn't handle the quiet. The third said he was too rough. The fourth said he was too cold. The fifth had claimed he had the devil in his eyes. Something shifted in his voice, like a crack in a frozen river, as he mentioned the sixth bride, who left a note saying she'd rather die alone in a city than live alone beside him. Maggie hadn't expected the flash of old hurt that crossed his face before he buried it again. And the seventh? She had looked at him the very first morning and asked Hank to take her back before breakfast. She didn't even sit down. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with something true. It was the crushing weight of an Apache man, living in a world that already viewed him with suspicion, who had been left so many times he had simply stopped expecting anyone to stay. He sat there, a fortress of muscle and scars, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to demand the stagecoach back. But Margaret Hollowell was done running. She looked at the single chair at the table. She looked at the massive, quiet man by the fire. Then, she walked over, pulled the stool from beside the wall, and dragged it across the rough floorboards to the table, directly across from his solitary chair. The scraping sound was loud and deliberate in the quiet cabin. Caleb looked up, his brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" he asked. Maggie met his gaze, her brown eyes steady and fierce. "Making it 2 chairs," she said, "because I'm eating breakfast here tomorrow." Caleb Drummond. She didn't look away. And the day after that. And the day after that. So you'd better get used to the sound of someone chewing across from you. Caleb stared at her for a long beat. He looked at the stool, then back at the woman who had just claimed her space in his desolate world. He turned back to his knife, resuming the slow, steady hiss against the stone. But he didn't tell her to leave. And in that tiny, fragile space between the strike of the blade and the crackle of the fire, the ice that had encased Caleb's heart for years felt the very first, terrifying warmth of a spark. The first few days on the mountain were a delicate, silent dance between two stubborn souls. They circled each other, wary and defensive. By the end of the first week, the silence cracked open over something as simple as coffee. Maggie had found a tin of old ground beans buried behind the flour barrel, determined to bring a small comfort to the stark cabin. She brewed a pot before dawn, the bitter aroma filling the rough-hewn space, and she set a steaming cup on the table where Caleb sat meticulously cleaning his traps. He picked it up with massive, scarred hands, took exactly one sip, and set it back down with a heavy thud. "That ain't coffee," he stated, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. Maggie turned from the cast-iron stove, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Excuse me," she challenged. "I said that ain't coffee," Caleb repeated, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto hers. "That's hot water pretending to be coffee." Maggie felt the heat rise in her cheeks. Her pride pricked. "I use the same beans you've been hoarding behind the flour like some kind of squirrel." "You didn't use enough," he countered, entirely unbothered by her rising temper. "I used plenty. You used half," refusing to back down from this infuriatingly calm man. Maggie marched over, snatched the cup straight from the table, took a defiant, long sip herself, and slammed it back down onto the wood. "Tastes fine to me," she declared, lifting her chin. "Then your tongue's broken," he shot back, his gaze unwavering. "My tongue works just fine." "Caleb Drummond," Maggie said, leaning in closer, refusing to be intimidated by his size. "It's your manners that need fixing." For a split second, she saw it, the faintest twitch at the corner of his handsome mouth. A slight, barely, there crack in the impenetrable stone wall of his stoic face. He almost smiled, but the Apache warrior buried the expression fast, grabbing his rifle and heading for the heavy cabin door, tossing a warning over his wide shoulder not to burn supper. As the door shut behind him, Maggie stood there in the empty cabin holding that cup of weak coffee. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain to herself, she was grinning. She hated that she was grinning. The young man was impossible rude, cold, and stubborn as a mule nailed to a fence post. But somewhere, beneath all that defensive bark and bite, she kept catching glimpses of something entirely different, something incredibly protective and quietly gentle. It was on the third day that the fragile wall between them truly began to crumble. Caleb emerged from the dense tree line, returning from his daily hunt. But Maggie saw the difference the moment he cleared the pines. There was dark blood soaking his sleeve and a heavy limp in his usually silent, graceful step. Her heart leapt into her throat. She dropped the heavy animal skins she was airing out and ran to meet him at the cabin door. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice tight with sudden, overwhelming fear. "Nothing," he grunted, refusing to look her in the eye. "You're bleeding." "It's a scratch," he muttered, trying to push past her into the safety of the dark cabin. Maggie planted her feet, bravely blocking the giant of a man. Caleb Drummond, you sit down right now and let me look at it. Or so help me, I'll wrestle you into that chair myself. Caleb blinked down at her. He looked at this young woman who barely reached his chest, yet stood before him with the fury of a fierce summer storm. No one had talked to him like that in longer than he could remember, defeated by her sheer, terrifying determination. He sat. Maggie carefully rolled up his blood-soaked sleeve, her breath catching sharply at what she saw. There was a jagged gash across his thick, corded forearm, deep enough to need serious cleaning. But thankfully not stitching. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she fetched hot water and dabbed the severe wound with a soothing salve she'd made from lard and wild herbs. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the intense, radiating heat of his large body. Her gentle, work-roughed fingers lightly brushed against his scarred, copper skin, and Caleb's breath hitched, the powerful muscles in his arm jumping beneath her delicate touch. The silence in the cabin shifted, transforming from something heavy and defensive into an atmosphere that was thick and electrically charged. "How'd this happen?" she asked softly, keeping her eyes intensely focused on her task, so he wouldn't see how fast her pulse was racing. "Mountain lion came at me near the creek," he replied, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated through her own chest. "Got one swipe in before I put her down." Maggie's hands didn't shake, but her chest seized with terror. "A mountain lion." She tied the bandage off, her voice growing dangerously tight. "You fought a mountain lion and called it nothing." "I fought worse," he said, staring straight ahead into the dying fire. She looked up then, her warm brown eyes searching his beautiful, heavily scarred face. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion, the shadows of a young man who had been rejected and punished by the world. "I know you have," she said softly, "and I reckon that's the problem." Caleb went entirely still. The flickering firelight played across the jagged scar on his jaw, highlighting the rugged perfection of his features. He looked like a weary soldier who had never truly made it home. He told her how he had fought for 3 long years, only to come back to absolutely nothing. His wife had left him, taking up with another man, and everything he had built was completely gone. His voice remained flat, a defense mechanism honed over years of isolation. But on the wooden table, his massive hands curled tightly into white-knuckled fists. He told her he came up to the mountain, built the cabin, and figured if the world didn't want him, he didn't want the world. Maggie finished wrapping the cloth around his powerful arm, tying it tight. But instead of pulling away, she did something that defied every rule they had silently established. She held his large, scarred hand, letting her fingers gently rest against his for just a moment longer than necessary. The blistering warmth of his skin sent a tremor straight to her core. Under the soft, golden glow of the lantern light, Maggie let her own walls completely crumble. She looked at this fierce man and offered him the deepest, most painful truth of her own life. "My family threw me out because no man would have me," she confessed, her voice thick with old, unshed tears. "Said I was too big, too plain, too much trouble." She took a trembling breath, her thumb absently stroking the back of his warm hand. "My own brother sold our father's house and put my things on the porch like I was something to discard." Slowly, Caleb's pale, striking eyes lifted to meet hers. As he stared at her, absorbing her pain, something fundamental finally cracked behind the ice. It was just barely visible, but it was just enough for a profound sliver of warmth to push through his defenses. He realized then that they were perfect mirrors of one another, two young outcasts, bruised and thrown away by the world, finding a secret refuge in the very place everyone else feared. He turned his massive hand over, his rough palm gently catching hers. It was an incredibly intimate, tender gesture from a man who hadn't touched another soul in kindness for almost a decade. His callous thumb brushed softly over her knuckles. "Your brother did that?" Caleb asked, his voice low and dangerous. "He did," Maggie whispered, her eyes shining. Caleb's jaw hardened, his grip on her hand turning fiercely protective. "Then your brother's a fool." Maggie's breath caught sharply in her throat. It wasn't a sweet, flowery compliment. It wasn't poetry. But, coming from this intense, solitary Apache man who had barely strung 10 words together since she arrived, it was absolutely everything. She saw the quiet reverence in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he saw immense value in the very woman the rest of the world had tossed away. She gently released his hand and stood up, feeling her knees tremble slightly from the overwhelming emotional shift. "Supper will be ready in an hour," she said softly, turning her face away so he wouldn't see her blush. "Try not to fight any more lions before then." As she turned back to the stove, she caught it. The corner of his beautiful mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a full smile, but it was closer than anything she had seen yet. And in that dimly lit, isolated cabin on top of the world, two broken people silently agreed to stop surviving alone and start healing together. Just as the fragile, tentative warmth began to thaw the bitter cold between Maggie and Caleb, a dark shadow crept up the valley from the town below. Trouble had arrived in Silver Falls, wearing a faded Confederate cavalry hat and a smile that never quite reached his cold, dead eyes. His name was Dutch Garrett. Dutch was a ruthless, rangy man with a face like a hatchet. He was a ghost from Caleb's painful past, a cruel rival who had not only stolen Caleb's first wife while he was away fighting in the war, but had also carved the jagged, terrifying scar into Caleb's jaw with a Bowie knife. Now, Dutch was back, but he wasn't just nursing a 10-year-old grudge. The world was changing, and a new railroad was scheduled to come through the valley next spring. Dutch knew that the little homesteads sitting on that prime acreage were suddenly worth a fortune, and he was determined to use his men, his rifles, and his fists to force the locals off their land. And the most prized piece of land, the ultimate vantage point, belonged to the Apache mountain man he despised. 3 days later, the outside threat finally breached the quiet sanctuary Caleb had built. The morning sun was already baking the pine needles as Maggie made her way down to the creek to haul fresh water. The mountain was eerily still, save for the rhythmic sloshing of the water in her heavy wooden bucket. Suddenly, the sharp snap of heavy branches broke the silence behind her. Maggie spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. Standing there, blocking her path back to the cabin, was a man she had never seen before, flanked by 2 rough-looking drifters with rifles resting loosely in their hands. Well, Dutch drawled, his voice dripping with venomous mockery. So, old Caleb finally found one that stuck. Maggie's grip tightened on the heavy bucket handle. Her blood ran ice cold, but her face transformed into unyielding iron. She demanded to know who he was. and Dutch tipped his frayed hat, introducing himself and claiming he and her husband went way back. Dutch's dark eyes traveled over Maggie's frame, moving slow and deliberate. The terrible way a greedy man sizes up a piece of property he plans to steal. He noted that she wasn't like Ellen, Caleb's fragile first wife. He sneered, stepping dangerously close into her personal space. He told her she was bigger, sturdier, and built to last. Then, leaning in so close she could smell the stale whiskey and chewing tobacco on his breath, he whispered the ultimate insult. Question is, does Caleb deserve something built to last? In that singular, breathless moment, Maggie didn't think about the fact that she was outnumbered by 3 armed men. She didn't think about her own safety. All she felt was a blinding, fiercely protective rage for the scarred, quiet man waiting for her back at the cabin. With a surge of absolute defiance, Maggie hoisted the heavy wooden bucket and threw the freezing creek water straight into Dutch Garrett's smug, hateful face. Dutch stumbled backward, sputtering and cursing, his faded hat knocked completely sideways by the force of the water. His men lurched forward, but Maggie was already moving, shoulders squared and her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it echoing in her own ears. She marched right past the armed men. She didn't break her stride as she called boldly over her shoulder, ordering them to stay off this mountain, and warning them that the next time they came near her, it wouldn't be just water. She walked straight up that steep, narrow trail with her fists clenched tight and her jaw set in stone, not stopping until she shoved through the heavy wooden door of the cabin. Caleb was inside. He took exactly one look at her soaked sleeves, her flushed cheeks, and her visibly shaking hands, and he was instantly on his feet, every thick muscle in his massive body coiled tight with lethal intent. His scarred hand found his rifle with such speed it looked like the weapon was a natural extension of his own arm. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice a dangerous, low rumble. When she breathed that Dutch had paid her a visit at the creek, Caleb stepped toward the door, his eyes dark with murderous fury. "Did he touch you?" he asked, the words vibrating with a lethal, protective edge. "No," Maggie said, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. "I threw a bucket of water in his face before he got the chance." Caleb stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, staring at her in absolute disbelief. "You threw water?" "Yes," Maggie declared, lifting her chin. "Full bucket." Right in his smug Confederate face. And then, something truly extraordinary happened in that isolated cabin. Caleb Drummond, the cursed husband, the fierce Apache warrior who had spent a decade terrifying anyone who crossed his path, threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't the buried, quiet rumble she had heard before. This was a real, deep, booming laugh, a sound pulled from somewhere so far down inside him that it sounded like it actually hurt coming out. Maggie blinked in astonishment. "Are you laughing?" His laughter died away. But a profound shift had occurred. His face hardened with the reality of the threat. But his pale eyes looked at Maggie with a newfound reverence. He realized then that this stubborn, beautiful woman wasn't just staying with him out of obligation. She had actively defended him against the monster of his past. The heavy word hours hung in the air between them, small and enormous. All at once, he looked down at her, and something deep inside his chest ached in a way he had long forgotten was even possible. But the reality of the frontier was harsh, and Caleb knew Dutch Garrett's pride would demand blood. He reached past her, locked the heavy cabin door, and turned back with deadly serious eyes. He told her that tomorrow he was going to teach her how to shoot. He handed her his second, shorter rifle, the one he kept closely guarded by his bed. As Maggie reached out to take the heavy, cold weapon, her soft fingers brushed against his rough, calloused hands. A jolt of pure electricity shot up her arm, and neither one of them pulled away fast enough to pretend it hadn't happened. At first light, the mountain was cloaked in thick, silver mist. Caleb led her out into the crisp morning air and placed the rifle in her hands. He didn't speak. The silence between them was no longer empty, but humming like a wire pulled tight, waiting to snap. He pointed to a small knot in a pine trunk, full 30 paces away, as Maggie struggled with the unexpected weight of the firearm. Caleb stepped intimately close behind her. She could feel the solid, comforting wall of his broad chest radiating heat against her back. His massive arms reached around her, his large hands gently guiding her, trembling fingers to properly grip the wooden stock. His cheek brushed the side of her hair as he leaned in to adjust her line of sight. His deep, steady breaths perfectly syncing with her own erratic panting. The masculine scent of cedar, leather, and fresh pine enveloped her senses. For a wild, dizzying moment, Maggie completely forgot about Dutch Garrett. She forgot about the danger lurking in the valley. All she knew was the intoxicating weight of this fierce, protective man holding her steady against the world. She squeezed her eyes, lined up the shot exactly the way he murmured into her ear, and pulled the trigger. The violent kick of the rifle nearly knocked her completely off her feet. But Caleb was right there, his strong arms catching her, anchoring her securely against him. They practiced for an entire grueling hour. By the end of it, Maggie's shoulder throbbed with a dull ache. Her ears rang from the deafening cracks of gunfire, and her hands shook with fatigue. But she had hit the knot on the tree twice. Caleb looked at the splintered bark, gave a single, approving nod, and said she would do. When she lowered the rifle, breathless and flushed, she caught a glimpse of his pale eyes. They were no longer the color of a frozen winter sky. They were significantly warmer, glowing with a soft, protective fire, like the very first signs of a beautiful thaw after a brutal, endless freeze. They walked back to the quiet cabin in a comfortable, companionable silence. Caleb effortlessly carried both heavy rifles, while Maggie carried the leather ammunition pouch. On the narrow, winding dirt trail, their arms brushed intimately against each other. And this time, neither of them moved away. The harsh reality of the frontier soon shattered their quiet sanctuary on the mountain. One evening, Hank Beaumont arrived at the cabin, his face grim beneath his crooked hat, carrying news that set Caleb's blood boiling. Dutch Garrett had hit the Morrison homestead that morning. He had taken their winter stores, every last jar, and violently roughed up old Tom Morrison when the man tried to defend his property. Caleb paced the small cabin. 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, the space suddenly too small for his explosive anger. His face was absolute stone, but his massive hands trembled with a rage, held so tight it looked like it might snap his bones. For years, his instinct had been to fight his battles alone, to let the world burn while he survived in isolation. But Maggie stepped into his path, her brown eyes blazing with a fierce, community-minded determination. She urged him to stop waiting for Dutch to pick the time and place. She told him to ride down to town, to talk to the Granger family, the widow Pierce, and everyone Dutch had threatened. She challenged the fierce Apache man to build something bigger than one man on a mountain, neighbors protecting what was theirs. Together, Caleb stared at her, the thick armor he wore like a second skin finally beginning to crack. He agreed, but only if they rode down together. They rode into Silver Falls before the morning heat set in, with Maggie sitting closely behind Caleb on a borrowed horse. She wrapped her arms securely around his solid waist, feeling the deep tension locked in his body like a coiled spring. The town was buzzing with terrified whispers as they arrived. Inside Anna Pierce's general store, frightened homesteaders sat on barrels and crates, their faces drawn with deep worry. Tom Morrison was there with his ribs wrapped, alongside his wife and the young, strong Granger brothers, Jake and Emmett. When Caleb walked in, massive, scarred, and intimidatingly silent, the room went entirely still. Maggie could feel him pulling inward, retreating behind the defensive walls he'd spent a decade building. She reached out and touched his arm just once, just enough to ground him. Caleb found his voice. The brilliant soldier inside him fought past the wounded exile. He stepped up and took command, drawing a map on Anna's counter and laying out a brilliant tactical plan. When Caleb spoke in sharp military shorthand, Maggie stood proudly beside him, translating his commands into plain language the farmers could understand. They worked in perfect rhythm, a truly united front, empowered by their strength. Jake Granger and Tom Morrison pledged to follow him. The raid happened just after midnight. Caleb led the nervous townsfolk down the steep mountain trail in single file, their boots wrapped in soft cloth to muffle the sound. Maggie brought up the rear, clutching her borrowed rifle tight against her chest, her heart slamming so hard she was sure the whole valley could hear it echoing in the darkness. They reached Dutch's camp to find the men drunk, sloppy, and dozing near a low fire. With military precision, Caleb raised his fist to signal the strike. He ordered Maggie to stay back, and for once, she obeyed. Jake Granger sliced the picket line, and Dutch's stolen horses bolted frantically into the black trees. Caleb fired a single, deafening shot into the air, the crack splitting the night like thunder. He roared a warning into the chaos, his deep voice carrying absolute authority, telling Dutch that if he touched another homestead, the next time they would aim lower. The homesteaders tipped the heavy supply wagons, spilling flour and precious whiskey into the dirt, before melting back into the shadows of the forest. But Dutch Garrett stumbled out of his tent, shirtless and gripping a pistol in each hand, his face twisted with ugly, humiliating rage. He spotted Caleb on the ridge and tried to goad him into a fatal shootout by maliciously mocking Caleb's past. He sneered at Caleb as a man who couldn't keep a wife, promising to deeply enjoy watching Caleb's newly built life burn to ash. Caleb's whole body shook with violence. Every old scar on his skin seemed to burn with the primal urge to kill. But Maggie stepped out of the shadows and firmly grabbed his arm. She looked up into his wild eyes and softly told him, "Let's go home." Caleb looked at her hand resting on his arm, took a shuddering breath, and turned his back on his worst enemy, walking up the mountain without looking back. It was the hardest thing the warrior had ever done. When they finally reached the quiet sanctuary of their cabin, the adrenaline of the raid slowly drained away, leaving behind a raw, stripped-bare emotional truth. Caleb barred the heavy door, set his rifles against the wall, and sank heavily into his chair. His broad shoulders slumped, his hands hanging loosely between his knees in sheer exhaustion. Maggie knelt gently on the floor in front of him, assuring him he had done the right thing by walking away. He lifted his head, his pale, striking eyes raw and stripped of every defensive wall he possessed. He whispered a heartbreaking confession he didn't know how to do any of this. He didn't know how to be a leader people counted on, or a man she could count on. He admitted he had been profoundly alone for so long. He had completely forgotten what it felt like to actually matter to anyone. Maggie reached out, her soft fingers lacing deeply through his rough, calloused hands. The warm lantern light caught the fierce, unwavering devotion in her brown eyes. She knew it was time to stop pretending. Her voice held perfectly steady. Even though her pulse was racing wildly, she looked at this beautiful, broken man and told him the absolute truth. She was falling for him. She confessed she hadn't come to this harsh mountain looking for love, but rather for a place that simply wouldn't throw her away. But he had given her so much more. He had given her a fight worth fighting. She refused to hide her feelings just because he was too terrified to feel them back. Caleb stood up. He was 6 feet and 4 inches of scarred, intimidating mountain muscle. Yet he looked at her like a man utterly terrified by his own fragile heart. Slowly, his trembling hand came up. This time, he didn't stop himself. His rough, calloused fingers gently touched her soft cheek, traced her strong jaw, and rested warmly against the curve of her neck, right where her pulse beat fast and frantic like a trapped bird. "I'm terrified," he admitted, his deep voice raw as torn earth. He leaned in intimately close, the heat of his body enveloping her. "But not of you, of losing you, of having something worth losing for the first time in 10 years. Maggie gazed up into his eyes, her heart swelling with an overpowering love. "He can't take what I don't give," she whispered fiercely. "And I don't give easy." "Caleb Drummond." "No, ma'am, you do not," he breathed. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a rushed, desperate collision like in cheap dime novels. It was a slow, incredibly sure, claiming. He tasted of dark coffee, sharp gunsmoke, and the profound, sweeping promise of a man who was finally done running from his own soul. Maggie kissed him back with absolutely everything she possessed. Every cruel rejection she had ever suffered, every lonely night she had cried herself to sleep in Ohio. Every time she had been told she was too big or too much, she poured it all into that passionate, soul-bearing kiss. And she felt his love pour back into her, doubled in its intensity. When they finally broke apart, breathless and forever changed, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. He pulled her tightly against his broad chest, wrapping both of his powerful arms around her so securely she could hear his heartbeat thundering through his shirt. It was steady, strong, and gloriously alive. Later that night, as the mountain waited outside in the dark, they sat across from each other at the small wooden table. Caleb reached across the worn wood and covered her hand with his. His thumb tenderly traced the calluses on her palm, the beautiful marks of a woman who had worked hard her entire life and had never once been thanked for it. He looked deep into her shining eyes and called her Maggie Drummond. His throat worked with heavy emotion as he made her a sacred vow. He promised to spend whatever time he had left in this world making absolutely sure she never felt thrown away again. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't fight them. She just let them fall freely, holding his hand tighter. knowing with absolute certainty that she had finally come home. The final confrontation was no longer just a distant threat. It was breathing down their necks. They left the quiet sanctuary of their cabin long before dawn, slipping out into the freezing, ink-black Colorado morning. Maggie carried the short rifle, the very one Caleb had pressed into her hands the night he first taught her how to defend herself. It felt entirely different now. It was no longer a heavy, foreign piece of cold iron. It felt like a natural part of her. It felt like the hard-earned calluses on her rough hands and the newly forged steel in her spine. Things she had rightfully earned through sheer survival. Caleb, the fierce Apache warrior who had finally found a reason to fight for tomorrow, walked ahead on the narrow path, his long stride eating up the steep trail. But every few minutes, he looked back over his broad shoulder, not to judge her pace, but simply to make absolutely sure she was still there. When they reached the base of the mountain, Hank Beaumont waited in the shadows with fresh horses. The news was grim. Dutch Garrett and all 7 of his heavily armed men had broken camp an hour ago, heading north toward the Granger homestead to take the valuable land by force. Caleb mounted his horse in one fluid motion and pulled Maggie up tightly behind him. As they rode hard toward the valley, the terrifying reality of what was about to happen settled over them. Caleb pulled the reins, the horse dancing nervously beneath them, and his deeply ingrained protective instincts flared. He looked at the beautiful, stubborn white woman clinging to his waist. He told her that when the shooting inevitably started, she was to find cover, leaving absolutely no room for arguments. He looked deep into her warm brown eyes, his voice rough with desperate devotion. He ordered her that if he went down in the firefight, she was to take the back trail to Anna's general store. "Don't stop. Don't look back," he commanded, his heart breaking at the very thought. Maggie's grip around his solid waist tightened fiercely. She looked right back at the scarred, magnificent man who had finally made her feel completely cherished. "I won't look back. But you're not going down," she vowed, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I didn't come all this way to be a widow before I was properly a wife." They arrived just in time. The Granger homestead sat vulnerable in a wide, sweeping clearing exactly at the bend of the rushing river. Caleb pulled their horse up sharply behind a rocky ridge overlooking the property. Below them, a thick cloud of dust rose ominously from the south. Dutch's riders were coming in incredibly fast, fanned out in a loose, terrifying line, with their rifles resting casually across their saddles. But Dutch didn't know he was riding directly into a brilliantly laid trap, hidden seamlessly along the ridgeline. 12 men and women were spread across a quarter-mile of high ground. They were not soldiers. They were frightened farmers and shopkeepers who had finally decided that standing together was better than dying alone. Dutch sat upon his horse in the center of the clearing, his faded Confederate hat tilted back, his cold eyes scanning the vulnerable homestead like he already owned every inch of the dirt. He shouted his final, mocking ultimatum, demanding the Grangers sell the land or face the brutal consequences. Suddenly, Caleb Drummond stood tall up on the high ridge, a massive, imposing silhouette against the rising sun. His deep voice rolled down the steep slope like a dangerous rock slide. "That's far enough." Dutch's face twisted in shock, his eyes darting left and right as he slowly realized he was entirely surrounded by hidden rifles pointing directly down at him. Knowing he was tactically outmatched, Dutch resorted to his cruelest weapon, Caleb's painful past. his voice carrying clear in the crisp morning air. Dutch viciously mocked Caleb, wondering aloud what would happen to Maggie once Caleb was dead. He twisted the knife, claiming this fight would end exactly the way it did 10 years ago, when the woman Caleb loved walked away with someone stronger, crouched safely behind the rocky ridge. Maggie's blood ran blazing hot. She watched Caleb's handsome profile, terrified that Dutch's poisonous words would break him open and turn him back into the broken, isolated exile he used to be. She saw the ghost of old pain flicker in his pale eyes, and she saw his massive hands grip his rifle tighter. But then, she saw an absolute miracle. She saw him finally let it all go, his voice steady as bedrock. Caleb declared that his first wife didn't walk away with someone stronger. She walked away with someone weaker. And that was no longer his heavy burden to carry. He stood taller, his chest swelling with profound pride as he looked down at his bitter enemy. He told Dutch that his new wife had thrown water right in his face without blinking. He declared that Maggie had taught the entire valley to stand up when Dutch tried to beat them down. "My wife is the reason you're looking at 12 rifles instead of one," Caleb roared, his love for Maggie completely eclipsing his old shame. Dutch's mask of control violently slipped, revealing an ugly, humiliated rage. "Kill them," Dutch hissed venomously to his men. Instantly, the quiet morning was shattered. A bullet cracked sharply into the rock just 3 feet from Caleb's head. But the warrior didn't even flinch. He fired back with lethal precision, hitting a charging rider's shoulder and spinning the man clean off his horse. The entire mountain spectacularly erupted. Deafening gunfire poured down from every high position as the united townsfolk fought back with everything they had. Maggie pressed her soft cheek hard against the cold rifle stock, aimed down at a rider violently charging toward the house, and bravely squeezed the trigger. Her shot hit his heavy leather saddle, the deafening crack enough to send the terrified horse bucking and the rider tumbling away. Dutch fought like a man totally possessed, wheeling his horse in tight, frantic circles and screaming desperate orders his men couldn't even hear over the thunderous gunfire. "It's over, Dutch," Caleb roared over the chaos. "Tell your men to stand down." Dutch's spiteful answer was a rogue bullet that tore viciously through Caleb's sleeve, grazing his thick, muscular arm. Bright crimson blood sprayed violently through the air. Caleb merely grunted, shifted his heavy rifle to his uninjured shoulder, and kept shooting. Maggie saw the bright blood, and her stomach completely dropped, disobeying every order he had just given her. She didn't stay down. She crawled frantically along the jagged, rocky ridge, completely exposing herself to the crossfire. She grabbed the cotton bandana from her neck and desperately tied it tight around his bleeding arm, while lethal bullets kicked up blinding dirt all around them. "I said stay down," Caleb growled, furious and utterly terrified for her safety. "And I said, I love you," Maggie shot right back, her hands fiercely tightening the makeshift bandage. Caleb stopped shooting. He stared at this magnificent, fearless woman who was risking her very life just to stop his bleeding. Amid the deafening chaos of the gunfight, something in his incredibly guarded face finally broke completely open, looking just like the clear, brilliant sky after a violent, raging storm. Below them, the resistance entirely crumbled. Dutch's last 3 surviving men threw their heavy rifles into the dirt, raising their hands in desperate surrender. The deafening gunfire slowly sputtered and died. Dutch Garrett sat frozen on his exhausted horse in the very middle of the dusty clearing, completely surrounded. vastly outgunned, and utterly, profoundly alone. His pistol was completely empty, and blood ran freely from a shallow cut above his wild eye. Caleb slowly lowered his rifle. He climbed down the steep ridge, his wounded arm hanging heavily at his side. Maggie grabbed desperately for his good arm to stop him from walking into danger. But he turned to her and softly said, "Please." That single, vulnerable word stopped her cold. He had never used it before. She let go, and Caleb walked steadily into the clearing, heading straight toward the monster of his past. He stopped just 3 feet from Dutch's horse. He looked up at the cruel man who had stolen his first wife, carved open his face, and haunted every dark, lonely night for 10 agonizing years. Dutch sneered, bitterly claiming that a few bullets wouldn't change what Caleb was. Caleb's voice was remarkably quiet, carrying the absolute peace of a man whose soul had finally been healed. "You're right," Caleb said softly. "A few bullets don't change what I am." But she did. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't demand bloody vengeance, proving that Maggie's profound love had entirely cured his need for violent retribution. Caleb simply stepped back. "Get off my mountain, Dutch," he ordered firmly. "I won't ask again." For a long, terrible, suspended moment, Dutch's hand hovered dangerously near his leather belt, right where a second, hidden pistol sat waiting, up on the high ridge. Maggie saw the treacherous movement. Instantly, her rifle came up, perfectly steady, aiming dead center at Dutch's chest. Dutch's dark eyes flicked up to the rocky ridge. He saw the deadly rifle. He saw the fiercely protective woman behind it, not shaking, not crying, just aiming with lethal intent, defeated by the very strength he had mocked. Dutch's hand dropped in failure. He turned his horse incredibly slow and rode out of the quiet clearing without uttering another single word. His broken, disarmed men stumbled pathetically after him down the valley road, until the rising dust swallowed them whole, banishing them from the mountain forever. The clearing was eerily quiet for just a second, before joyous, victorious whoops echoed off every ridge. Maggie didn't celebrate. She scrambled wildly down the steep ridge, half running and half sliding until she reached Caleb. She grabbed his wounded arm, tears of absolute relief streaming down her beautiful face. He pulled her in, wrapping both of his powerful arms tightly around her, burying his face in her sweet-smelling hair, holding her against his rapidly beating chest. He made the only promise that mattered. "You're not going to lose me," he whispered fiercely into the quiet morning air. "I promise." And standing together in the golden light of the new dawn, they both finally knew that they were completely, perfectly safe. They rode back up the mountain as the sun dropped low in the fading sky. Caleb's wounded arm ached terribly, and Maggie's exhausted muscles screamed in protest. They were bruised, bloodied, and completely bone-tired. But when the rough timber of their cabin came into view, solid and waiting, a profound peace settled into both of them. Caleb dismounted his horse first and gently helped Maggie down. His large, calloused hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary, grounding her against his strength. He looked deeply into her eyes and declared that he was going to build that second chair tonight. Ignoring her gentle protests about his one good arm, he grabbed the heavy axe, found a good piece of fragrant cedar from the woodpile, and started working. Maggie sat quietly on the porch step, and watched the man she loved. His movements were understandably slower than usual, the fresh wound pulling painfully with every swing. But he didn't stop and he didn't complain. He just shaped the wood with the exact same steady patience he used for absolutely everything in his life. An hour later, in the deepening twilight, he set a newly finished chair on the porch beside the heavy door. It was rough-hewn and uneven, built by a one-armed man in the fading light. But to Maggie, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Caleb stood over her, sawdust dusting his dark beard, blood on his bandage, and those pale eyes burning with something that looked a lot like pure joy. "There," he said, his voice a thick rumble of emotion. "Now it's two." Maggie reached up, grabbed the front of his shirt, and pulled him down to her. She kissed him incredibly hard, tasting salt and fresh cedar and the faint copper trace of blood. He braced himself securely against the new chair with his good arm and kissed her back passionately, like a man who had been starving and had finally found bread. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his warm forehead against hers. He whispered 3 magnificent words for the very first time: "I love you." It was rough and cracked and completely imperfect, like everything about him. But it was incredibly real. It was realer than anything either of them had ever been given. They stood embraced on the porch of that rough cabin, the very place where 7 brides had come and gone. It was a sanctuary where a broken soldier had tried to disappear from the world, and where a beautiful woman nobody wanted had planted her feet and absolutely refused to leave. Below them, the sprawling valley stretched wide and green, and the winding river caught the very last light of the day. Smoke rose peacefully from homesteads that were still standing simply because ordinary people had chosen to stand fiercely together. Maggie leaned deeply into Caleb's solid chest and asked what happens now. He tightened his strong arms affectionately around her, telling her that now they truly live. As the day completely faded and the first bright stars appeared over the high country, Caleb Drummond held the incredible woman who had saved him from himself. He made a silent, unbreakable vow to spend every single morning for the rest of his life, making absolutely sure there were 2 cups of coffee on the table, 2 chairs on the porch, and a door that was always open. Margaret Drummond, the woman the world had deemed too big and too loud, had done what no army, no blizzard, and no 7 brides before her had ever managed. She had made the fierce Apache mountain man believe he was finally worth staying for. And she had stayed. And that, my friends, is where we leave Maggie and Caleb. Their beautiful journey reminds us of an undeniable truth. True worth isn't determined by the people who couldn't see your value, or the family that discarded you when you needed them most. Sometimes, you have to climb a steep mountain and fight tooth and nail for your own space, just to find the one person who recognizes that your unwavering strength is your most beautiful asset. You are never too much for the person who is meant to hold your heart. Thank you so much for riding along with me today here on Eagle Eye Apache. What did you think of Maggie and Caleb's incredible love story? Please share your thoughts down in the comments below. I read every single one. And don't forget to drop a comment telling me what city and state you are listening from. Today, if this story touched your soul, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who loves a good Wild West romance. And hit that subscribe button so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Until next time, stay strong, hold your loved ones close, and may your trails be beautiful.